Hey everybody, thank you. It looks like we have a great room here. We appreciate it very much and your attention and a lot of competing sessions, and we're going to try to make great, valuable use of your time here today. I'm pretty honored to share the stage with these guys here today. So on my far right is Mike Quinn. Mike is the president and CEO of Preservica, and Preservica is a long-term preservation software and services product company. And to my right, we got Rich Hale, who's the Chief Technology Officer with Active Navigation, which is a leading company for file analysis. And we're going to be speaking to you today about end-to-end governance of your content. And we talked about end-to-end. You know, it's been interesting. I've been coming to the MER Conference for a lot of years, and we talk about a variety of topics. But, you know, at the center of the MER, the name, Managing Electronic Records, it's around records management. And all of us, a lot of us already have in your enterprise, you've got your file plan created, you've got your enterprise, and by the way, I should advance the slide because better than seeing us in person is seeing a picture of us. There it goes, and see it does go there, you see, all right. And by the way, we do have our Twitter handles on there and stuff, and we're socially aware, so if you want to tweet, hopefully it'll be something positive or good, and the opinions are ours, and so decide what to trust on your own. All right, so we're going to be covering end-to-end governance, and I brought it to an analogy of the telephone world and the cable television. You get the first mile and the last mile, and I'm going to cover that here in a second. The end-to-end governance, we have our massive volumes of content that are out in all of our collaborative systems and our cloud systems, et cetera, in the wild, as we sometimes say. And then all the way at the other end of the extreme is our very valuable and very well maintained and organized records, and in this case our long-term preservation content, and the special care that we want to take with the content that we do need to keep longer term. And we'll be talking about what kind of content and what do we mean by giving that special care. And I use this analogy, first mile and last mile. If you've ever been in the telecom space or cable, et cetera, it's one thing to lay down a fiber for the main backbone, but then it's the reaching the houses. It's that last mile and first mile. So I grabbed that metaphor and that analogy, and we're using it here as well. So as I mentioned before, we're here at the MER Conference. You guys probably already have your file plan. Most of you should already have your records system in place and where you keep and store your valuable information assets for your company, your system or systems of record. And then you're retaining and disposing, hopefully disposing, based upon your retention schedule. What is a challenge for probably most of you in the room, or maybe not addressed, and I'd like to hear later, so conversations, that kind of thing, is how about that first mile and the last mile? That first mile being all that content in the wild, wherever it lives. File shares being a common place, and a lot of our customers are now in initiatives to, as we said, kill the file shares and get to a more modern cloud-based platform. But we have a variety of things that are in that first mile for collaborative content. In the cloud and on-prem, some of it old, some of it still really new, but it's the huge volumes. Then we have the long-term preservation, and that is that content types that you want to keep longer than 10 years, say. It's an arbitrary number, but the content that you want to keep longer term, think about how fast the technology is changing in our environment. 10 years ago, we barely had iPhones just introduced, just before 10 years ago. So just think about every decade technology cycle, and if you have valuable content, which you do, that you need to keep longer, there's special care. So Mike's going to be talking about that a little bit with us as well. So our focus on the end-to-end is assuming here that you've got the middle pretty well covered. We're going to be really talking about the first mile and the last mile. And another way to look at that, outside of the dolls from a moment ago, and this one we have it upside down here, we have the most valuable stuff at the top there. But we're going from high volume content systems, cleaning that up through defensible disposal programs, managing some of that stuff in your records and in your core record system, and some content in as long term. So that first mile, again here, a lot of that content in your file shares, I've got customers that we're doing privacy projects a lot right now, and interest in complying with the New York cyber regs, interested in complying with the CCPA, et cetera. And we've got challenges with, we have privacy information in our unstructured data across hundreds of terabytes of file share, OneDrive, et cetera, kind of data. And the files are not named, hey, this one contains social security numbers, et cetera. They're named everything else. And so we need to do analysis and find out what is in that content, because a lot of it is not only unknown, it's dark data. It's that stuff that violates your policies and violates all these regulations that are coming up nowadays. So how do we find that vast amount of content out there and decipher what is going to be of value to store in that record system under better control, and what do we dispose of through the disposal programs, that file share cleanup programs? How many of you are moving to modern systems for, say, SharePoint, OneDrive, Box, or other, say, cloud content systems? Show of hands there. Yeah, most everybody here. And a lot of you, are you just wholesale picking up all that content and moving it over to the new systems, or are you doing cleanup in advance? Cleanup? Yay! All right, good answer there. So in order to do that cleanup, we need that file analysis, that capabilities to scan and index vast amounts of content and report on it, chart it, analyze it, and then be able to act on it as well. And so that's that first mile of your content. And the goal here, if that's your representative sample of the content that you have, and each bar kind of represents then the rot and the medium value rot. We Integro, so by the way, to clarify, Integro is a services consulting company working with technology, and we help with the information governance programs and policies and the technology, and really the union of these two things and where they come together. So we are good at helping very large companies with very large data problems in order to get compliant. And some of the tools we use are represented on the stage here, of course, Active Navigation and Preservica as two fine examples here. And I've got clients in the room that represent that very large and vast amounts of data as well. But our goal here, if on the left is your current state with your data in the wild on your file shares, Integro, we have a procedure to go through using these tools, a lot of rules around what is high risk or high confidence that it's rot, risky, outdated, trivial, we've all got our acronyms for it, medium confidence and low confidence. And by just using the analysis tools, we can find and identify by file type and age and location, a variety of rules, that high confidence rot, which when we can take action on without further human involvement, say, and then medium rot, which have more process on it, and then the low confidence rot, that is where we think it's rot, but hard to take a mechanical action on it across the board. Then you've got the risky content, sensitive, privacy information, and then the valuable. And so the chart here shows reducing your rot. We commonly see goals here in the 40, 50% or more in reduction in the content in the wild in that first mile. Mileage may vary. Oh, here, I spoke to this slide and I could have shown it here. But delete with no business value on the high confidence rot, temp files, old log files, et cetera. Medium confidence, things that are named archives and outdated, et cetera. And then low confidence, photos, large disk images, things that have additional review required in the process. And then we have the systems and methodologies to go with the tools then to go with that. Now the last mile, you have content that, there are a lot of content types. I'm sure all of you have your file plans. I think everybody kind of acknowledged that a little bit ago. Raise your hand if you have records categories that are longer than 10 years. Okay? Okay, pretty unanimous here. And of course we do, but then the question comes, and so you'll recognize the types of content, statutory, regulatory, contracts, et cetera. You have those file types and you know you need to keep them. So then the question becomes, how and what are the challenges there. And again here, this really echoes what we just did with raising the hands. Pretty unanimous. 98% of the organizations have long-term records categories, and you know it. I think is the theme here. Information managers are aware, and but the long-term records have risk. And here are more types. But Mike, I want to ask you a question. You know, everybody here knows they have long-term records, and they have record systems in place. What might they be missing in their plan for just stuffing those files in there and keeping them for longer than 10 years?
It really depends on the use case, Scott. So there's no one-size-fits-all answer here. It depends what your institution does, and it depends what the records are. And this slide attempts to show some of that there are variations across different industries, and there are retention periods which are either mandated by the regulations within your industries or just make up good corporate sense. You know, your particular business may want to hang on to information because it has inherent value to the business, or there may be a regulatory reason for that. So I think the question was, why don't you just keep it in your enterprise content system? The answer is, that may be perfectly suitable if it's a live record and it's going to go through multiple iterations over many, many years. In fact, that's what an ECM system is designed to do and what a records management system is designed to do. The issue is when it becomes a permanent record and it's immutable, it's basically archivable. This is a permanent record, we finished adding to this now, and we don't want to do anything more with it. Where should we keep it? Then you should be looking at something that protects against technology obsolescence. And keeping it in a ECM system is not the best strategy because of two reasons. First of all, it's at risk of technology obsolescence and tampering. And secondarily, it's a very expensive way to keep those long-term records. You should be thinking differentially around how you maintain those records.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and we're going fast, by the way. Rich, can I pull you in here? We talked about like a use case and to talk about a sample industry here. And so we looked at oil and gas. And Rich, can you dive in here and then take us further down the path of talking about that first mile and file analysis, please?
Yeah, sure, no problem. I'm tempted to stand, and I might have to if I get too excited. Scott,
that's all right.
You got the buttons.
You better, because I'm going to fall off the stage.
Yeah, I always like to, first of all, just to be clear, you know, Active Navigation, we're a file analysis company. We sell file analysis software, and that's all we do. And I think that's quite an important point to make. In my time in doing this, I've been doing this for about 12 years, and I left the Royal Air Force, which is a very respected organisation in the UK.
That's the cool accent too,
yeah,
right?
hence the cool accent. Mike, although he's English, is not ex-Air Force. But even though I wasn't what I call an information professional, which I count all of you ladies and gents as information professionals, the one thing I couldn't get over is how anybody would consider dealing with data without understanding what it is. It felt unforgivable to me. Or conversely, and I use the metaphor of buying a new car, taking all the stuff, all the rubbish, from their old car and just pushing it into the new car, you know, when they buy new. I could never get my arms around that. And as a guy who was slowly coming up to speed with information, I just asked a fundamental question, what have I got? And I was shocked that I couldn't find out. So that's how I got involved in this world, and I've been doing it ever since. This example here is about an oil and gas customer of our own, a downstream oil and gas company. For those who don't know, and to the best of my knowledge, it's all about taking refined crude products, petroleum and the like, and distributing them, refining and distributing them out to customers. And like every organisation, they need that first mile. I think everybody in the room knows they need to get started with data cleanup. In fact, the hands up. I'm interested in the cleanup projects. Are they all active? Is that 100%? Who's got, of all those projects that people put their hands up for, how many are active cleanup projects right now? What do you reckon? 50%?
About half the audience probably raise their hands.
So for me, the first mile is all about getting started, and every organisation needs a chance to get started. I've had, back in the Air Force days, I used to talk to pilots and the guys that used to punch holes in the sky, and that even though they were professional airmen, They kind of got that this still was an untenable situation, but of course they were just interested in blowing stuff up. So, they need some help on the journey, and that's the first mile really, is getting started. That's where file analysis comes in, and really the first mile is understanding. So back to these guys here at a downstream oil and gas company, 50 terabytes of data, it's quite a lot, though we get a bit blasé with our data sizes these days. Anyone want to take a guess as to how many objects are in 50 terabytes of unstructured data? Someone give it a go. No prizes, but show your prowess as information professionals. How many think it's...
How many container ships is it? There's one of my customers in the audience right now, and she relates it to container ships.
Container ships.
I like that one.
Go on.
That's pretty big. But keep going.
Well, no, I was going to say literally how many objects. One up the back there. 50. Bang on. Peter, did you tell her? My boss is sat next to you, but I'll assume you got it yourself. The point I'm making here is we get very blasé about data scale these days. 50 terabytes, small beer relatively, but for this headquarters organization, that was the entire content, it was 50 million. For all intents and purposes, totally unsolvable. You can't engage with that amount of data. So the file analysis job is to get started, hence the first mile metaphor. How do these guys get started? It's about data in motion, in my opinion. Unless you can knock it out the park in terms of your business cases and the way you manage your peers and your budgets, very often it's data in motion that makes these things happen. In this particular case, it was about sunsetting some systems from LiveLink and a very weird system called Buzzsaw, which is a drawings platform for the oil and gas industry. So high value data, and those platforms have just become obsolete. And to your point, Mike, about how you preserve this stuff, this is very much on their minds, but they didn't know how to get to grips with the data. So that's how they got started. The other point I'd make is to coin a phrase or a term from a respected Gartner analyst, Deborah Logan, people and technology got us into this mess, and people and technology must get us out of it. So we provide that technology. These guys built a team, 2 ladies, on an especially large team, 2 ladies, 50 million objects, and a file analysis tool, and they get started. And what was really interesting about their journey is that they got started on their how they addressed their data in LiveLink, in Buzzsaw, just to understand what it was, with the target, of course, being the wonderful SharePoint platform. I'm sure you do plenty of that, Mike,
yep.
But aren't we all bored with SharePoint? They got started, they built the team, and they built what I call their file analysis capability, which I think all organizations need. The file analysis capability is the combination of the people, the processes, and the technology to engage with large piles of data in order to clean up, in order to add value, in order to preserve, to do that whole life cycle, first mile to last mile. Can I do the next slide, do you think?
Yeah.
Awesome. So they developed, these are their questions. You'll have your own variation of them. Fundamentally, the job of file analysis is to allow you to ask these questions. What was interesting about this team is they got started with this migration, but they quickly learned that this was a product they could sell to other organizations around the business. And they developed this playbook, which is a series of questions which they could answer with a file analysis product with their knowledge very, very quickly, and always unlocked the next steps for each of their customers they engage with. So starting at the top, really these are the same question asked in 2 different ways. What do you have that the company needs to keep, and does it have business value? They kind of answer themselves. I guess they're the same thing. What I would say is we lose the sight that these guys are dealing with old systems or loose data in file shares. And fundamentally, the answer is, if it's old and lying around in a file share, it's often got a copy, if it's valuable, in a business system of some sort. And so they can engage with the data in a file share, using file analysis to understand a little bit about what it is, clean that data away, knowing very much that the valuable stuff really does lie in one of these Buzzsaw or LiveLink type repositories. Is it a duplicate? A fascinating question. A deduplication, how many people engage in a deduplication effort for data in the wild? It's actually pretty tough.
Yeah, everybody wants to do it.
Everyone wants to do it. It feels like the really easy thing to do. I just say that this is where sort of made-for-purpose file analysis differentiates from e-discovery and other types of tools, because it's designed to answer these questions in the wild. And so the ability to compare repositories, look at your repository of record, and compare it with your file shares, look at the stuff that's lying around, which is like courtesy copies, that the duplication onion can be peeled back using file analysis, but it's not as straightforward as it might appear.
Well, because what do you do with the duplicate? Who's the duplicate?
Who has access and who has the rights, et cetera, et cetera. So file analysis is all about unlocking that. We use a technique called what we call our master strategy, that allows you to compare repositories, clean down your loose copies, so your repository of record provides your master, if you like, to handle that problem. Sensitive information, to my mind these days, if no one is dealing with this right now, they've got a real issue in their business. Surely it's just a slam dunk. GDPR, CCPA, global privacy regulation is what moved the lazy acronym of PII, personally identifiable information, we've been throwing around the industry for years, and attached some regulation to it and some teeth. Yeah. And these days, my view is whenever an organization deals with data in motion, it's unforgivable to not scan it for sensitive data. Why wouldn't you do that? You know, whether you're preserving it, whether you're pushing it to the cloud, whether you're unwittingly exposing someone's payslip data to a very broad search capability, is what SharePoint would provide you, it's unforgivable to not analyze for sensitive data. And then lastly, I'll just pick up these other ones. You know, once you've answered all those questions, does it need to be preserved in some way? In one of the early engagements these guys had, they did a small sample of about 4 million objects, about 4 or 5 terabytes, and they found about 300,000 objects that were due for collection on some legal hold case using file analysis. Also, about 10% of the data, about 450,000 objects, needed to be preserved in some way. They archive them. I don't think they have your capability, Mike, but they need your capability, you know, and they went on the first steps to looking at this valuable well data and determining that it needs to be kept. And the next step will be to be considering how they preserve it. So move on one more then, if you can, Scott. Let me just explain how this file analysis works. All file analysis deals with data discovery. And it's, as I said, it's all about understanding what data you have. I'll take issue with a little bit of the slide up here. It says any information governance project. I'm just going to put a line through governance. Any information project, in my view, you need to understand what data it is you're dealing with. Moreover, actually understanding it helps you unlock paths and approaches to dealing with that data you didn't anticipate. So data discovery is kind of the first mile for file analysis. A real complete solution needs to integrate all the actions that go with it. And so we pick out here data cleansing. Scott mentioned those around cleaning up rot, sensitive and duplicative data, using the techniques provided in the file analysis, but also the expertise that your teams provide, or teams like Integro, for example, provide to bring light to the data. Modeling is really important. It's about how you develop the rules and the algorithms, test them, using the data surfaced by file analysis to classify them appropriately. Scott mentioned classification, taxonomy development. What we do is we spend a lot of time in our tool providing you the ways of visualizing the way your data matches up against your taxonomy or classification, and particularly spotting areas where there are holes in the classification. Very often we find the data on the ground doesn't match your top-down analysis. The next step for everybody, I think, is to sort of match the classical top-down analysis of records or data mapping with bottom-up analysis so they keep those sorts of models evergreen. Metadata tagging is all about adding value to the data, either in place without moving it, or if you're going to migrate from a live link to SharePoint, placing labels on the data so that you can exploit some of SharePoint's features in workflow, in disposition and the like. And then migration itself is actually the lifting and shifting and migrating and tagging the data in motion. That's the capability that we provide, and we like to sort of differentiate ourselves by saying that we provide that full life cycle as well as closing the loop. And pretty much, from my perspective, this is file analysis is not for Christmas, it's for life. You know, you need to close the loop, you need to make a capability that keeps this going and keeps your environment evergreen.
How'd you know it was on my Christmas list?
Mike.
File analysis, you know.
It should be on everyone's Christmas list, surely.
Yeah, exactly.
So one more slide for me, if I may.
Did I go the wrong way?
Yeah, you went the wrong way. You scared me.
Let's hit that button.
So this slide here, hopefully it's not too much for everyone, but what I wanted to do is illustrate some of the things that the team in this case study actually did with file analysis as they learned how to deploy it across a range of different business units. And let's be clear about this, because they've had great success in spotting sensitive data, in cleaning down their data, in identifying things for archive and triage and the like. They learned how to sell this across their business. So if we look down the bottom left, you've got sort of low impact but relatively easy tasks, and that's of course where I recommend you start. Top left is all about transformational tasks, things that are really going to enable you to do different stuff with your data. And then top right is the stuff that's actually harder you need to gauge with on a slower time cycle as you've got practice. So if we start with the purple, you got too keen, Scott.
What's that?
You got too keen, but it's fine. The 3 purple spots are the things you should be considering immediately as your first mile. So cleaning up your rots in bulk. And what I mean by that, you should be looking to take 10, 20, 30% out of a 50 terabyte slice. You really can once you get up to speed with capabilities like ours. And then identifying, remediating PII, PHI, sensitive data, privacy-related data, to my mind, as I said just now, is unforgivable that you don't. And that's certainly what the team were doing in this case study. They spent a lot of time then moving on and tagging data. The particular piece I want to bring to front is aligning their data with their master data management system. Anyone not familiar with master data management as a concept? Great, or no one's going to own up. A couple.
Or is everybody?
There's a couple, yeah, no one's owning up. So let's just stick with that.
Yeah.
So master data management, understanding how you classify all your most important assets in the business. So for these guys, it was all of their technology for managing their pipelines, managing their transportation systems, their refineries and the like. So big lumps of hard machinery. And a master data system defines and captures every lump of machinery in the business. Needless to say, each machinery has drawings associated with it and all of the codes and identifiers that go with all those drawings. So what they were able to do with our software was line up, by analyzing the data, identify files that were potential records and potential preservation objects as they associated with their master data system. So they'd find this well number in this document that aligned it up to this drawing, and there they found a valuable piece of data that was either subject to ongoing record management discipline or eventual preservation. The last thing, because I've spoken for too long, the last thing I'd say is...
You're doing good.
Am I doing fine? At the top right, they got very much into understanding that mergers and acquisition were important lines in the sand for their business. When they receive data, clearly they want to be sure they understand the nature of that data, so again, push it through their file analysis process. When they dispose of data, it can be helpful to make sure that there's no kind of smoking gun lying around in that data, which is what file analysis can do for you. And really, once go on, sir.
We did a project for another oil and gas, and they had sold off multi-billion-dollar set of wells, et cetera, and they had already cleansed all their files. They had everything all packaged up and ready to hand off for the acquiring company, and who was a competitor, by the way. They were selling these oil assets to a competitor, and we came in and did a file analysis on the content that they were going to hand off, looking for that sensitive data. And interestingly, we found guess what? A Word document, or I think it was a Word document or Excel, with every server and the admin passwords and the jewels to their IT network was packaged up and about ready to be handed off to their competitor. So mergers and acquisitions is such a great use case for file analysis tools, for sure.
I hadn't mentioned admin passwords. I don't think an engagement goes past without stumbling across admin passwords in
when we do proof of concepts, we go in and search for the CEO's privacy information and also then passwords and things like that, and things that we know we're going to get hits on.
Yeah, and this has become a big issue with breaches lately, haven't they? Because that really opens up the Pandora's box.
Well, and the Sony breach really shined a light also on, people said, so what if it's on our email and it's just transient content or our files? The other one is the Mossack Fonseca case down in Panama, the law firm that, they thought they could hide behind attorney-client privilege and they just kept things around. Well, they had clients from like 30 years ago that their files then got published, and within days, the head of Iceland, one of the top guys, was having to resign because of the data that was revealed. So the content that's in your systems, and at Sony, right, it was their derogatory emails about some of their key celebrities, and it's not what you want published. So if you don't need to have it, it falls into that rot category. An important thing, I've heard this before, and I'm sure you guys already know this, but there's only 3 reasons why you need to keep something, right? 1, you have a legal obligation. It's on legal hold. 2 would be you have a regulatory requirement to keep something. Or 3, it's a business value. Now, that business value might be for that end user for that day, or it might be a business value record that you want to keep longer. But if you can't answer yes to at least one of those questions, you not only can, but you should dispose of that content. You're just paying to carry it around for no reason. Those are the three things.
I'll just close off then because
Yeah.
you know, the other point I'd make is no matter which one of these dots you engage with first, it's actually relatively easy to turn it into a continuous life cycle, the blue dot at the top. So the reason the blue dot is over in the low effort is once you've got started and done one project, embedding this in your business is much more straightforward than it might first appear.
There you go.
And the watchword these days, it's appearing in the regulations, it should really appear in our daily vernacular, it's data minimization. You're taking down your volumes, removing sensitive data, and ensuring that you're expending your assets on the right data, and ultimately ensuring that that data lives.
So are you saying that data minimization is not just for Christmas anymore?
It's for life.
It's
Scott,
all the time?
You're with me there. So that's all I would say for file analysis, but certainly over to you, Scott, I think.
Thanks, Rich. That's awesome. Thank you. And so that's the first mile, right? That content in the wild and analyzing it and being able to take action on it. And note here that we're talking about both governing some content in place, okay, whichever of the many kinds of repositories that are your collaborative systems where that content is, we can take some action on it, removing some of that content, et cetera, or you might need to then move it, so manage in place or move to govern, and you might be moving it to your records, system of records, and we might be moving it to Preservica. And we're going to talk about why Preservica is a valuable option as well. So again, we have record systems already in place, and Mike, you're going to talk to us here about future-proofing our assets that are digital.
Well, the very first thing is, if you notice, we've very swiftly moved the analogy from telecommunications to a marathon. Did any of you notice that? So
right,
we did that,
exactly.
the first mile and the last mile. But staying on the marathon for a moment, how many of you have ever run a marathon or half marathon, just out of interest?
No.
Yeah, well, quite a few people. Okay. The first mile is the hardest because that's when you're going to get trampled to death by other runners, basically, and you're trying to get the right pace. Because if you set off too quickly and you're not used to it, you're going to get, you're going to die pretty quickly. But the important point about the last mile is you can't get to the last mile without the first mile, of course. So so it's very important that you sort out your files and you work out what your strategy for the last mile is. The last mile is the most excruciating one. But the other thing to think about is you don't actually start marathon training thinking you're only going to do 22 miles. You actually plan to finish. And in fact, the most valuable mile is kind of the last mile when the crowds are there along the street egging you on to finish. So it's a kind of a good analogy.
I don't know. I've never had that experience yet.
So that's an important analogy. The key thing about preservation is once you've sorted out the content that you want to keep, and it is important to your business for the three reasons that Scott described. And what were they again, Scott? The three reasons?
Legal, regulatory, business value.
Very important. So you need to keep those documents or whatever those digital files are for a long period of time. Why don't you just archive them? What's the difference between archiving and preservation?
I was going to ask you that. What's the difference between archiving and preservation?
I think we might have a slide for that.
All right,
slide
so
for that?
advance it here.
Okay. So the difference between archiving and preservation is essentially that archiving keeps the bits. What you're doing is you are archiving the bits and you're putting it into a long-term store. Preservation is very different because what you're doing is you're protecting that content against future technology obsolescence. Heaven forbid that your IT team in a few years' time decides to swap out your systems and replace System X for System Y, or decides to turn off these servers, or to move this content from this mainframe up into the cloud, or to put a new operating system in. It never happens, does it, really?
No, and what we see with our clients is you have constant needing to upgrade because the software upgrades or the storage is out of support, and we need to change out the underlying physical layer, the software layer, et cetera.
That's right.
It can be a big project.
Yeah, and that's the real issue, that you're talking about content that is important to your your institution, your business. By definition, you've actively sorted it. You've defined your long-term policies on this. You need to keep it for the reasons that Scott's described. And then all of a sudden you're in a situation where we'll forget about it in 10 years' time, or when we need to access it quickly. And generally speaking, we're talking about assets that may have very important use for you, either for legal reasons or business value reasons. And so the difference between archiving and preservation is archiving stores the bit where digital preservation actively monitors that content and ensures that it's upgraded to new file formats and new ways of reading this information as time goes on. So you can access this information that's discoverable and usable. And the questions to ask yourself really about this information, which is what's up here, and this stays with the example that Rich kicked off in the oil and gas industry, is you need to ask yourself, what is the content that we're trying to keep here? Is it standard Office documents? And actually an Office document is an Office document. That will persist forever. It will be human readable and we'll be able to do something. It's pretty standard. Or is it, are we dealing with complex types of information? And the example we're giving here is actually if you're managing diverse and complex file formats that might require different applications, different operating systems, and completely standalone systems to generate that content. They might be born digital scanned documents, images, so on and so forth. In the oil and gas industry, amongst the most expensive data sets are the seismic information, for example, discovery information. That's pretty important. So the first thing to ask yourself is how complex are these different types of digital objects that you're working with? And we're living in an age now where digital objects, records, are becoming more and more complex. An email, something as simple as an email, is very rarely just an email now. You might have an embedded image in it. You might have a link to a website. You might have a contract. You might have an Excel spreadsheet. You might have a video attached to it. Does that email constitute the record? If it does, all those are digital objects that are at various risks of becoming obsolescent over time. Maybe not the Word document, but maybe the video will be at risk in 10 or 20 years' time. So you need to think differentially around the type of content. The second thing to ask yourself is this mission critical? Is this actually mission critical to my institution and the value of my institution over the long term? The mission critical might be that adds value to your institution. So things like land leases, rights and permits, staying once again with this example, is pretty important. But there are other things like occupational health and safety. We're actually working with an oil and gas organization in the North Sea at the moment, and they have 30 oil wells which will be around for decades to come, and they have maintenance records going back to the 1970s and 80s, where they were actually doing site visits, and the engineers were recording everything from site visits. Interestingly, exactly to Scott's point, a lot of these oil wells were mergers. They were mergers and acquisitions.
Oh, yes.
So those assets were acquired, and all these site visits, which constitute essential records of the maintenance of those oil platforms, were records. Right. And in legacy systems that can't be read anymore. So they were exported to just some files. The systems were decommissioned, but essentially unreadable to the field operation people. And that's the other thing about preservation, is think about how accessible this information needs to be. If it can be totally non-accessible, if your institution, it doesn't matter if we can get hold of this information, but we know it's archived somewhere, then archiving is perfectly suitable. But if you need to actively and dynamically interact with it, then you need preservation.
So am I correct? This is a cloud-based offering, so I don't have to have the servers and the storage on-prem.
Yeah, I think the key thing about preservation is you should think of preservation in terms of abstracting it from the underlying applications. And so it should be system agnostic and storage agnostic. And so if you're planning your strategy around this, you need to be thinking about how do we make sure that the information is not locked in the enterprise system, necessarily if it's an end-of-life record and it needs to be preserved for the long term. And secondarily, where is it stored? You might want to store it in the cloud, and the cloud is a very good option. And there, you can certainly have redundancy in the cloud. You can have multiple cloud providers, and there are multiple locations.
Right.
And companies like Amazon and Microsoft Azure and Google, they do a great job of that. So, keeping the bits safe in the cloud are important, but ensure that you've got the ability to keep transforming those over time, and indeed move it from platform A
And when you say
to platform
transform
B.
it, so you're saying if it's a CAD drawing from 1999 or whatever, and you put that into the system 25 years later when, like today or in the early 20s here, when we need to go open that, that file has been upgraded to the current file format, so that when I open it in today's CAD drawing, it works, and I don't have to stand up an old Windows 95 PC that has that old software on it to view it?
That's exactly the point.
That's what I think is so important in what you're providing, is that future-proofing, right? Updating those files actively. That's what you call active file?
That's active digital preservation.
Active digital preservation?
And it's file format migration over time. And the real issue here is that your successors won't thank you if in 30 or 40 years they look back at the records preservation system and say, what the hell is this?
I'm going to be on a beach, so it's not going to matter.
Yeah, I don't. No, interestingly, archivists, another group of folks that we work very closely with are archivists, and archivists, like records managers, are concerned about this, but archivists tend to think about 50 years ahead, whereas most of us are thinking about
you work
5.
With a lot of museums?
Yeah, a lot of museums, a lot of national archives have already cracked this issue. But those folks get the idea of history. They get the idea of, we owe it to society.
What's the most interesting thing or library that you've archived, you think? You got something particularly interesting?
Well, the thing I'm most proud of, I think, the things we do with human rights organisations, actually. So there are human rights organisations that are actually preserving the records of, famous war tribunals and so on. Amnesty International is one of the organisations we work with.
Yeah.
They're preserving stuff now. They're preserving stuff for things that haven't happened yet.
Uh-oh.
They're preserving records now, satellite images of war zones and destruction of historical monuments and other atrocities that are happening, because in 30 years' time, when the people who committed those crimes come to account, they'll want to prosecute them. And in 30 years' time, no one will be able to read the old files. So they're using a preservation system forward in time. So it's really interesting that if you think of this time dimension, you can think of it in 2 ways. Either you're sat where you are now, thinking about the records that you are custodians for your institution, and how you're planning forward for this eventuality. You've sorted them, you've actively managed them, you know what your most important assets are, and you're thinking forward to it. Or you can think about it as, what's the accumulated risk that I've already inherited? Because my institution had records from 30 years ago, and I'm sitting now on records that are already pretty old. And that's one of the key issues. And so the way to think of this really is it's a continuum. The point I'm making here is that you don't plan preservation as the end of the journey. In the same way you don't run a marathon to finish at 22 miles, you run a marathon to do the last mile. You need to think of preservation as combining that whole race. So this whole idea of the records life cycle begins at the beginning, and the institutions who are taking the best advantage of this are saying, what are the things I need to retain forever, and have I thought differentially around our most valuable assets and how we preserve those. So you need to future-proof what you know is long-term. And there's several reasons why you might want to do this, and Scott, you talked about one of the key ones, which is corporate memory, which is retaining and reusing critical, historical knowledge. And a lot of the information that we preserve, although they're records, a lot of this increasingly is soft information. It's information which is captured on things like websites. We heard this morning social media. A lot of it is videos now, and so on and so forth. If we're not preserving that content, that content will also be lost over time. And that's the soft content for your institutions. But there are legal and regulatory reasons. Rich, you touched on the application decommissioning challenge that the client you worked on was there. What were the systems they were decommissioning?
LiveLink, a very old version of LiveLink, so more a record repository, I guess, and then this buzzsaw capability, which is a drawing repository and tied intimately to the underlying drawing format. Yeah. So there's definitely space there.
The ones we come across are things like Lotus Notes. Any Lotus Notes users here at all? Regrettably, a few of you. Yeah. So, you know, we get a lot of those folks who've got old Lotus Notes applications. The content's vital. IBM's discontinuing. Sorry?
Nah.
I mean, IBM's discontinuing, you know, active support for that. So how do you manage that situation? Yeah. So this point about application rationalization is important. But one of the most important aspects of this is the authenticity, and it's worth discussing with you, Rich, because you talked about some of the things you do with metadata to sort out the authenticity.
The problem I have with the whole information space, perhaps being an engineer, is information, particularly left in the wild, just got this half-life, a really short half, which just decays so fast. Mm-hmm. And so to my mind, we've been allowing our data to decay for so long. If you don't do something about it soon, you're going to lose any sense of provenance, authenticity, and the like. So to my mind, there's a lot to be gained in getting what you can and drawing a line in the sand and saying, look, no more. And, you know, and gathering just enough metadata as well. I think the other point that may gum us up, and I think this is what you're getting at, is the desire to go and get all of the metadata. Yeah, I can imagine 50 different fields that might describe this document. That's going to freeze your program immediately. So how can you gather just enough metadata to drive the requirements for preservation or record management or legal or whatever?
Yeah, that's right. And actually, you know, a good handoff between active navigation's capability and ours is the ability to capture the right metadata. Yeah. But over time, you need to enrich that for stuff for future generations that need to come back and discover this information in different ways. So this whole question of metadata enrichment becomes important. But how do you ensure that you capture the right amount to ensure handoff to you know, a preservation system like ours?
Capture it before it becomes useless as well. You know, and that's often the case.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. And we're doing pretty good on time. We're going to a little bit more, and then we're going to take some questions, and hopefully you'll have some questions out there. So action items. You guys are filling your heads full here at the MER Conference. A lot of notes. Saw a lot of good note-taking out there. Next week, it'll be a blur. You'll be back to all the emails you got to catch up on, and right? And so what do? So we do recommend some action, though. Take a look at some content in the wild. So we could do with active navigation, we can come in and do a small proof of concept, an analysis of a few terabytes of your data, and uncover what some of those skeletons are in your closet and get some representative data samples of, okay, we did 2 terabytes, 3 terabytes, we've got 100 terabytes. If we extrapolate this out, that means, oh, guess what? We have half our content we don't need anymore, right? If you're in the range of common numbers there. And doing that analysis and understanding, having a better sense of what you have, and then making it so you can start to make a plan for, do we need to do something? What do we need to do? And how to make a program out of it. And so it's not hard to get started, especially on the analysis side. Just do some analysis, get something going. And everybody out there, I'm sure all of you would say, oh, I know we have stuff we're not supposed to have, and I know we've over-retained content, but you can't quantify it. Well, quantify it. Just get started and quantify some of that stuff. Look at your records retention schedule and think about the things that Mike was bringing up. And should you be having active file preservation, digital preservation, so that 10, 20, 30 years from now, they're not going, oh, great, we got to stand up, you know, right now we got to stand up an old tape drive, a system to be able to run an old format. Same thing happens for your files and the systems that those files are on. If it's a long-term preservation asset class, information asset class, put it in a system that's going to be future-proofed and in the file formats that are continually upgraded. So review your plans. And, you know, privacy regs, so we're doing a lot with like I said, the privacy regs. It's good for us, and it's good for all of you in the room as well, because it's helping you get the budget and the energy and the teams built because when your company, the internal audit committees are flagging your company as being out of compliance, hey, that's good stuff, right? Because now we can finally get the budget we need to do the projects. Privacy is super important. Make sure you're learning about those privacy regs and what it means for your data and your content. And we can use ActiveNav for that. And there's a lot of services around helping come in and just stand up a system and process your content, help you go through, how do we go through quarantine? What do we delete right away? You know, what's the process? Because you can't just, it's one thing to find it. It's another thing, you can't just delete the content because it's running your business. And if it's really important, then disposing of it because it had privacy information without knowing what your contingency plan is a problem. And so key takeaways, seek some vendor agnostic expertise. So again, that's some of the role that we at Integro play, is we can help you assess what your problem are, your current statement, where you're at today, your future desired state, and help make a plan for how to get there without just saying, well, guess what, I sell screwdrivers, and the screwdriver is the tool you need, folks, right? So look at that way. Clean up that content in the wild, the file shares, collaborative systems, get on top of that, address future-proofing content from the start, and to operate at scale. I assume a lot of these companies in here, you have a lot of data. You have a lot more files than you're going to be able to open and process yourselves. So think about how you're going to do this at scale, both for Christmas and for an ongoing basis. I'm going to keep using that. You mind?
Use it,
I got a
Scott,
kick out of that. Any questions from the audience? Luckily, no hecklers so far, so that's good.
Yeah, sure. Just wait. If you need if you have a question, just
Did you
wait
plant
for the
a
mic.
shill in the audience to ask any easy questions, Labs, for us? No? All right. Here we go right here. Mohammed, thank you.
Thank you. We are actively trying to clean up file shares, but my question was more around for long-term retention rules. Insurance industry, we have abandoned property, 40 years.
Wow.
It moves
Right.
across Salesforce information, imaging systems, legacy record-keeping systems. You know, so that particular life cycle of record series goes across multiple technologies.
Data in a lot of formats and
Right. So how do
structured
you,
data,
you know, just to
unstructured.
sit down and we'd have to figure out all of those pieces and then preserve that for 40 years. You know, that's something we're trying to do based upon destruction readiness procedures, you know, getting at a lot of decommissioning. You know, how do you go about doing that?
Planning, first off. I mean, it's like I said at the beginning, right? Take the big problem and start breaking it up into the small problems. And first off, really get a solid understanding of the current state, like you were describing a moment ago. What are our desired objectives, the goals that we need to be able to produce? So like Mike said, who needs to access it in 40 years from now? How will they access it? How will they look it up? And in what formats do we need to produce that information? So get that current state, desired state, and then start to make that plan for how do we package that up, because we don't want to put it into that long-term, you know, archival preservation until the collaboration part of it is done, right? If it's active right now in Salesforce, say, so you've got to think through the active life cycle and then the long-term preservation. It's not an easy, you know, whatever. It's a process. It's an engagement, a process to think through that. But break it down into smaller problems.
I guess
Yeah.
I just
You
make
wanna
a
add to
comment.
it?
Yeah, I'd always say try and get started. And I know that sounds, but just to reinforce the messaging, because the danger is in the complexity that I know everyone in this room sees. Let's face it, there's no corporate information problem that's not complex. The danger is you get utterly frozen. And so I guess one of the things I look at is how are those systems decaying over time? My sense is that, you know, 40 years old, that data's already decaying. And so, you know, I think there's the burning platform that means you've got to start doing something. A file analysis package, and my aim here is not to particularly talk about my technology as an of, but you have to understand what's actually there. And I think that's why I talk about file analysis as the first mile. Good file analysis product can give you a view across all of those systems and help you begin to make a decision about where you start. And that's kind of my message. I guess, Mike, one advantage of preservation in that situation would be to get away from those device systems into a single platform.
Yeah, absolutely. So if there's stuff that's burning a hole at the moment, if there's stuff where you're thinking actually these systems are going to be decommissioned or there's no support or whatever, the very first thing is you can just migrate that all into a preservation platform immediately, and it's preserved. It's not saved, oddly enough, because you can still run it from there into you know, you do some analysis, but at least it's preserved, and it's not, you know, there's no danger of losing the data.
And and you talked about there's a variety of content types, so it'll be a set of documents or content types that'll make up the record.
A good preservation system will identify, it will do something called characterization. Characterization is, you might have lots of files in there. They're legacy applications we don't understand. They have suffixes which we don't even understand. What is a .dat file? We've no idea what that is. We can't open it. When we try to open it, we can't open it. A good preservation system will immediately tell you what it is and immediately identify that for you, and give you a way of rendering that as well. That's the other point, which is we'll be able to open it, we'll be able to render it, we'll be able to look at it, and we'll be able to you know, act on that. Now, once you've opened it, you might determine, I don't know, if we need to keep this. That's where, you know, file analysis might help.
Do we have one more question?
Oh, we've got an
And
end.
I think we're at the end of the time. Hey, folks, thank you very much for your attention and time, and hopefully we added value. Thank you.